Thank you to literally everyone for requesting this episode. Welcome to Conlang Critic, the show that gets facts wrong about your favorite Conlang. I'm Misali, and in this episode we'll be looking at the language of we who ride, Dothraki. As you saw before, this is by far the most requested language for me to review. Dothraki is one of those rare mainstream adjacent Conlangs that you can expect an average nerd to know about. I mean, not every Conlang has been joked about on The Office, you know? There really isn't any other language I could have begun Conlang Critic Season 3 with. Dothraki is a fictional language created for the book series A Song of Ice and Fire, and its adaptation, Game of Thrones. Even though series writer George R.R. Martin created the initial seed that eventually grew into the Dothraki language, most of the important work of creating it was done by David J. Peterson, who was hired for the HBO series. David Peterson was able to take the fragments of text in the original books and flesh them out into a fully functional language. He also has a pretty significant online presence, so there's a non-zero chance that he's actually you, the viewer. In which case, hey Dave, big fan. The art of language invention taught me a lot of what I currently know about conlanging, and the Smiley Awards were part of what inspired me to make a series of conlang reviews back in 2016. Oh, and if you're not David Peterson, that's absolutely not an invitation to go flood his Twitter mentions with links to this video. He's a busy guy. Anyway, I've never read A Song of Ice and Fire or watched Game of Thrones, so I can't actually speak for how the Dothraki language is portrayed in universe outside of what I know from reading about the language itself. Going in, I knew that the Dothraki people are supposed to be violent and that they ride horses, and that's about it. I considered watching Game of Thrones for the purposes of this review, and then I immediately decided that that was a bad idea. I was originally planning on only relying on free resources for this, which is what I usually do, but the wiki on Dothraki.org leaves much to be desired. Fortunately, I was instead able to get a lot of the missing information I needed from DJP's blog and the book Living Language Dothraki, which I picked up basically as a last-minute decision while writing this episode. And I gotta say, this book sure is an official piece of Game of Thrones brand merchandise. It's really funny to me how the cover designers Ryan Sachs and Lauren Houston put the official Game of Thrones logo real big at the bottom, nice and readable from a distance, while the name of the author is right there in the fine print, taking up about as much space as the words a conversational. Anyway, Dothraki's consonants are m, n, d, j, g, g, d, j, g, th, th, s, sh, ch, h, v, z, j, w, l, r. Yeah. Since Game of Thrones is pretty popular, a lot of people have made a lot of claims about what the Dothraki language reminds them of. As it turns out, it sounds a whole lot like Arabic and Russian among people who don't know what Arabic or Russian sound like. Anyway, the phonology was one aspect of Dothraki where David was somewhat creatively restricted. It needed to be compatible with the original corpus, and it needed to be reasonably pronounceable by English-speaking actors on a TV budget. That second restriction is why, for example, the voiceless stops are allowed to be aspirated, since it's kinda hard to get English speakers not to aspirate voiceless stops. One thing that stands out right away about this consonant inventory is the lack of labial stops. David ended up deciding on that after realizing that in the source material they don't appear in any Dothraki words other than names. It's explained through a sound shift that turned them into labiodental fricatives, which also works as an explanation for why the is the only voiced fricative that isn't a sibilant. Also notable here are some rarer sounds. The uvular stop and velar fricative both function as the token consonants that sound harsh to typical English speakers. In the context of the whole inventory, they don't seem out of place, and help give Dothraki a distinct aesthetic. The other rare sound here is that dental fricative. It's a sound that's paradoxically both strange and familiar. Again, I don't think it's really out of place here, and given the spelling of the word Dothraki, I don't think David really had much of a choice regarding its presence. If the TH in there represented anything else, the word Dothraki would have no sensible in-universe reason to be pronounced the way it is by English speakers. Dothraki's vowels are E, O, E, A. Now that's what I call a 4-vowel system. It's just the standard 5-vowel system, but without oo. However, that's just if you look at it on a phonemic level. There's a lot more going on if you take allophony into account. After a uvular stop, everything moves around like this. Uvular sounds have a tendency to move vowels around, so it makes sense that that happens in Dothraki too. On top of that, O becomes unrounded after dental sounds. This doubles the total number of vowel phones up to 8, and that's before we even bring up the diphthongs. There aren't any diphthongs, it's just 4 vowels, 8 vowel phones. Now, although there aren't any diphthongs, Dothraki is completely fine with having 2 vowels in a row within a word, even if it's the same vowel twice. It's sorta like how consecutive vowels work in Japanese. So this is a 4-syllable word pronounced like chaleesi. In universe, Dothraki isn't a written language, so the romanization system here is pretty straightforward. Everything's basically spelled how you'd expect in a typical fantasy language, which makes sense because this romanization actually came before the phonology. There's not much to say here, just a bare bones, fully phonemic romanization, exactly what it should be in this context. There's one thing that's different between the romanization of DJP's Dothraki and Dothraki as it appeared in the books, and that's the spelling of the voiced post-alveolar sibilant fricative, j. In the books, this was the digraph jh, which has mercifully been changed to the far more sensible digraph zh. Dothraki is a highly inflectional language, relying on a variety of different affixes for most grammatical things. A pretty basic example of this is the way nouns are declined for case and number. The 5 cases in Dothraki each have their own set of suffixes for different contexts. Most of these have different forms depending on if the noun in question ends with a consonant or a vowel, and most also have a completely separate plural form used exclusively for animate nouns, with inanimate nouns not being marked for number at all. An extra animacy distinction is made on top of that for the 2 most common cases, nominative and accusative. For animate sounds, in the singular, the nominative case is unmarked and the accusative case has a suffix, but for inanimate nouns, it's a bit more irregular. The table here is the analysis of Dothraki nouns used by the Dothraki wiki, saying that inanimate nouns can take many different nominative suffixes, and can either be marked or unmarked in the accusative. But in reality, it's more regular than that. For an inanimate noun that ends with a vowel, the accusative is marked by removing the vowel, so the word Jano, meaning dog, becomes just John. And then it's this form of the word that takes the suffixes for other cases. For an inanimate noun that ends with a consonant, like arach, meaning sword, the nominative and accusative are usually the same thing. The a suffix for inanimate nouns in the accusative is mainly used for words that would otherwise end with consonants or consonant clusters that aren't allowed word finally, but it's sometimes unpredictable. Here's the different cases of the word sondra, obsidian. The cases themselves are pretty solid. The allative and ablative cases in particular are nice to see here. They form a nice pair with each other, basically corresponding to the English prepositions to and from. Having these as the only 2 locative cases was a good call. The default word order is subject, verb, object, which is kind of boring, but it's one of the things that was already there in the books. Also evident from the books is a complete lack of a copula. These features probably didn't have any actual thought put into them, but it is cool that David was able to incorporate them into his full version of the language. Adjectives follow and usually agree with nouns. The way adjectives agree with nouns is a little bit strange, but in a believable way. For adjectives that end with vowels, there's a suffix applied marking the plural even when the noun itself wouldn't normally be marked for number. And then there's a suffix for when it isn't nominative, which is only applied in the singular. I guess this makes sense as like a single suffix that covers 4 different cases, but given how other things in Dothraki work, it's strange not having a separate adjective suffix for the non-nominative plural. Since Dothraki doesn't have a copula, adjectives in general can be turned into stative verbs by simply applying the appropriate verb suffixes. So since dik means fast, the word for to be fast is dikat. Adverbs in Dothraki are a part of speech separate from adjectives, so the adverb chik, meaning well, is completely unrelated to the word for good. They are placed sentence finally, but can also be placed sentence initially for emphasis. Like most suffixes in Dothraki, verb suffixes work differently depending on if the root ends with a vowel or a consonant. Here's what this table looks like for the verb dothralat, to ride. Yes, this is the verb that the name of the language is derived from. Now here's a conjugation table for the verb ifat, to walk. This system makes Dothraki verbs look more complicated than they actually are, in a way that mostly feels natural. Now something that's exactly as complicated as it looks is how Dothraki does negation. So first of all, there's a basic prefix that's used for negating adjectives. However, that prefix isn't used for negating the superlative forms of adjectives. To do that, there's a separate sublative suffix that replaces the usual superlative suffix, which means that adjective suffix table is actually incomplete. That's all pretty normal. Nothing too complicated yet. The complicated part is negating verbs. So basically there's the negation particle vos, which goes before whatever verb needs to be negated. And then since this is Dothraki, it becomes vo if the verb in question starts with a consonant. Then on top of that, the verb itself is given a specific negative suffix. It's sort of like how Finnish does negation, but a bit more complicated since it's different depending on what affix the verb would have had to begin with. This level of complexity, where it's regular but in a somewhat unpredictable way, really helps Dothraki feel natural in a way that I haven't seen a lot of other fictional languages pull off. The attention to detail here is far more than what you usually get out of a language created for a TV series. Like any good fictional language, the vocabulary in Dothraki is representative of the culture that speaks it. It's full of these little gold nuggets of world building that really paint a good picture of what the Dothraki are like. And it's handled a lot more cleverly than what par for the course would be from a language spoken by a quote-unquote nomadic warmongering race. While granted, there are certainly at least 3 distinct words for to kill listed. There's also things like how the word for fake primarily means wooden, which makes sense for a group of people that makes things out of wood. The way to say earthquake literally translates to horseless stampede, which is absolutely fantastic. The best sense of culture I got from reading about Dothraki was from the various idioms used for things. A lot of these involve riding, like asking someone "Hashier dothrae chik" as a basic way of saying "how are you?" It literally means "do you ride well?" I also like the phrase "Hazi vom rajor," which is translated as I don't care, but literally means that's not in my heart. The Dothraki language implies its speakers to have a complex, rich culture, who certainly care a lot about riding horseback into battle and all that, but aren't solely defined by that. Again, I have absolutely no experience with or interest in the actual source material, so I don't actually know how the Dothraki are portrayed in the story they're from. Despite that, the fact that I was able to get any sense at all about what they're like just from reading about their language is a huge testament to how well DJP was able to con this lang. Outside of things that specifically have to do with Dothraki culture, what made me really happy was seeing words that were made in honor of specific people in David's life. Like the word for good or kind is erin, which adorably comes from his wife's name. Also named for DJP's wife Erin is the word alegra, meaning duck, which is from her middle name. I absolutely love that sort of thing. Now, I mentioned Dothraki's animacy distinction earlier, and it works in a way that's pretty interesting. See, usually animacy is just a way of distinguishing living things from non-living things, and in more extreme cases, distinguishing between people and things. In Dothraki, it's actually more like a grammatical gender distinction, but without the whole agreement system part. Heck, not even pronouns need to agree with animacy in Dothraki, so it's not like really a grammatical gender thing, just a run-of-the-mill noun class thing. Which of the two classes any given noun falls into isn't really about if it's alive or not. A river is animate, but a horse is inanimate. Anyway, here's all the pronouns in Dothraki. I was more amused than I should have been seeing that the third-person singular pronoun is me. You look at enough Indo-European languages and you just sort of expect something like me to be a first-person pronoun, but nope, why should it be? Numbers in Dothraki are pretty regular. There's some basic roots for numbers 1 through 10, plus a prefix for multiples of 10. Yes, boringly, this numbering system is in decimal, which was actually an active decision and not just the result of not bothering to think about what base the numbering system should use. Quote, I wanted to realize the language as it might be imagined to exist in the universe of A Song of Ice and Fire. So even though a conlanger doesn't need an excuse to, say, create a number system that relies on a base other than 10, I felt like I needed a pretty good reason to do anything other than what an English-speaking audience would expect. In the books, numbers are pretty much exclusively base 10. In addition, since the Dothraki and those groups that border the Dothraki Sea all trade, I think it's not unreasonable to assume that by the time of the action of the books, everyone will have converted to the same base. This sort of thing happened a lot while I was researching for this episode. Basically, every time I saw some aspect of Dothraki where I said to myself, well, that's kind of boring, I then looked a bit more and found somewhere where David Peterson explains that it's boring for completely understandable reasons. It makes me wonder what Dothraki would have been like if DJP hadn't been under the restrictions of needing to work with HBO and having everything be fully compatible with the original books. Oh, this has nothing to do with Dothraki, but when the heck am I going to get another excuse to talk about this? So, well over a decade ago, David Peterson made a language called sassier, and that language has a numbering system that uses base 6. If you're new to the channel, that's my favorite base for about 40 minutes of reasons. Anyway, I would just like to take this opportunity to point out that DJP got the base conversion from decimal to sextimal wrong here. 100 is 2/4Z4 in sextimal, not 4/4Z4. That's what I'm resorting to now, insulting people I respect for sextimal boners they made before the start of the Obama presidency. This is a new segment where I provide an example of a language in use. I'm putting it here, right at the end, before the rating. In the future, this will actually tend to be me speaking the language myself, but since Dothraki was created for a TV series, I figured a much better way to get a sense of what the language is like is to just use audio from the show itself. And I gotta say, it was absolutely more trouble than it was worth finding this audio. It's unlikely that I'll end up doing the spoken sample part this way again. This audio is from Game of Thrones Season 1, Episode 7, You Win or You Die, spoken by the character Khal Drogo, portrayed by Jason Momoa. Let's take a listen.
Nashilak jinna shafka, ajerukonde shafka. Marjanan, ishvin hasaja hisheseres. Man anhaveloshak ash aka. Man anhaveshak jin adorchikate. Vina neve ave maisimai. Ana vjakman reshi sandakre. Ana jedrogo atakjin.
Oh, right, I should mention that I'm not doing rankings anymore. Instead of trying to directly compare languages with each other, I'll just be concluding with my final thoughts on how good I think the episode's conlang is. Saying something like, All in all, Dothraki fully deserves to be as popular as it is. Given the circumstances of its creation, what David J. Peterson was able to accomplish really can't be called anything other than expertly made art. If only it were attached to a more interesting work of fiction, you know? It's sort of like Navi, where the Conlang is good on its own merits and also happens to be connected to a story I couldn't care less about. Game of Thrones is certainly better for having the Dothraki language in it, but Dothraki is good despite being from Game of Thrones. But you know what they say, the circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. And as I said, Dothraki is good on its own merits. In a vacuum, it's a piece of world building that feels more than real enough to be believable. It certainly isn't perfect, but it's about as good as it could have been. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, where I'll be reviewing Novial. Hey, is this anything? The lady doth Rocky too much, methinks. No, that's nothing.